March 1944, Camp Atlanta, Phelps County, Nebraska. The prairie wind carried the scent of fresh-turned earth across the barbed wire as 20-year-old Friedrich Hartmann pressed his face against the cold metal fence, staring at the endless grassland that stretched toward a horizon he could barely comprehend. He had never seen land so flat, so vast, so utterly unlike the rolling hills of Bavaria where he'd grown up helping his father tend dairy cows. 3 months ago, he had been fighting in the North African desert. 2 months ago, he had surrendered to British forces near Tunis. 1 month ago, he had been transferred to American custody and shipped across an ocean to a place he'd never heard of, to work fields for a nation he'd been trained to hate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Friedrich didn't know, standing there in his worn Wehrmacht uniform with the letters PW stencil painted on his back, was that this foreign soil would become more home to him than Germany ever had. That the statistics working against him, the impossible circumstances of an enemy alien on American soil, the hatred and suspicion that should have buried any hope of a future here, would all collapse before something more powerful than war or borders or national identity. What he didn't know was that he was about to embark on a different kind of battle, one fought not with rifles but with determination, one measured not in territory gained but in trust earned, one that would transform him from enemy soldier to Nebraska rancher in a journey that defied every probability. The numbers told a grim story for German prisoners of war in America. Of the approximately 371,000 German POWs held in the United States during World War II, fewer than 5% would remain after the war ended. Most were repatriated between 1945 and 1946, shipped back to a devastated homeland where cities lay in ruins and the economic collapse made survival itself uncertain. For those few who dreamed of staying, the obstacles were formidable. Anti-German sentiment ran deep in American society. Immigration laws were restrictive. Jobs were scarce even for American citizens. The idea that an enemy soldier could not only remain but thrive seemed statistically absurd. Friedrich Hartmann had been born in 1924 in the small village of Oberammergau in southern Bavaria, where his father Karl operated a modest dairy farm on land that had been in the Hartmann family for 4 generations. Friedrich was the youngest of 5 children, with 3 older sisters and 1 brother, George, who was 6 years his senior. Their mother Anna died of influenza when Friedrich was only 7 years old, leaving Karl to raise 5 children while managing the farm. It was George who became Friedrich's role model, teaching him to milk cows, mend fences, and read the weather in the Alps that loomed over their valley. When Hitler came to power, Friedrich was 9 years old. He watched the village change slowly, then rapidly. The mandatory Hitler Youth meetings. The radio broadcasts that his father listened to with increasing worry. The disappearance of the Goldstein family, who had run the village bakery for as long as anyone could remember. George, always the practical one, told Friedrich to keep his head down and focus on the farm. But in 1939, when Friedrich was 15, George was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. He wrote letters home for a year, careful letters that said little of substance. Then the letters stopped. In 1941, Karl received official notification that George had been killed in action near Smolensk in the Soviet Union. Friedrich's father became a shell of himself after that. The dairy farm declined. Cows were requisitioned for the war effort. Feed became scarce. When Friedrich turned 18 in 1942, his conscription notice arrived. Karl said nothing as his youngest son packed his few belongings. He simply embraced Friedrich at the door and whispered words that would echo across years and continents. Do not die for ideas that are not yours. Come home if you can. Build something good. The Wehrmacht training was brutal and efficient. Friedrich was assigned to the Afrika Korps and shipped to North Africa in late 1942, arriving just as Rommel's forces were beginning their long retreat. He served as a supply truck driver, moving ammunition and food across impossible distances through sandstorms and heat that made the Bavarian summer seem like a cool breeze. He witnessed the chaos of Kasserine Pass, the grinding battles across Tunisia, the slow collapse of German forces as Allied superiority in men and material became undeniable. When the end came in May 1943, Friedrich felt only relief. He and dozens of other German soldiers walked into a British encampment near Tunis with their hands raised, exhausted and grateful to still be alive. The British were professional and correct. They processed prisoners efficiently, separated officers from enlisted men, provided food and water and medical care. Friedrich spent 2 months in a British POW camp in Algeria before being transferred to American custody. In August 1943, he boarded a transport ship bound for the United States, packed into holds with hundreds of other German prisoners, crossing the Atlantic in a strange reversal of the invasion he'd been told would never come. They landed at Norfolk, Virginia in September 1943. The sight of America shocked Friedrich. The abundance of everything. The huge trucks and trains. The well-fed American soldiers. The civilians going about their lives as if there were no war happening at all. He and other prisoners were loaded onto trains and transported west, watching through barred windows as the American landscape unrolled like a movie. The Appalachian Mountains. The Ohio River. The endless fields of the Midwest. When they finally arrived at Camp Atlanta in Phelps County, Nebraska in late 1943, Friedrich stepped off the train into a landscape that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Camp Atlanta was one of dozens of POW camps scattered across Nebraska during the war. The state's agricultural economy was desperate for labor as American men shipped overseas to fight, and German prisoners provided the solution. The camp housed approximately 600 German POWs who worked on surrounding farms during planting and harvest seasons. The facility consisted of rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers, but the security was relatively relaxed. The prisoners were not considered dangerous, most were grateful to be out of combat, and escape was impractical. Where would they go? Into the endless prairie that surrounded them? The work began in spring 1944. Friedrich was assigned to a labor detail working farms around the small town of Holdridge, about 15 miles from the camp. Every morning, trucks would transport groups of prisoners to various farms where they would work under minimal supervision. The American farmers were initially suspicious, sometimes hostile, but they needed the labor desperately. Sugar beets needed thinning. Corn needed planting. Wheat needed harvesting. The work was hard but familiar to Friedrich. He understood crops and seasons and the rhythm of agricultural life. It was on one of these farms, a sprawling cattle and wheat operation 5 miles north of Holdridge, that Friedrich first met Thomas Donovan. Donovan was 48 years old, a third-generation Nebraska rancher whose grandfather had homesteaded the land in the 1880s. He was a tall man, weathered by sun and wind, with hands like leather and eyes that seemed to measure a person's worth in seconds. Donovan had 3 sons. The eldest, Patrick, was fighting in the Pacific with the Marines. The second, Michael, was serving with the Army in Europe. The youngest, Sean, was 17 and helping run the ranch while attending the local high school. Donovan's wife Catherine managed the household and the ranch's books with quiet efficiency. When Friedrich and 5 other German prisoners arrived at the Donovan Ranch in April 1944, Thomas Donovan met them at the gate with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He looked at each man in turn, then pointed to the fields where spring wheat needed planting. He gave instructions in clipped English, which one of the prisoners translated into German. Then he added something that made the translator pause. He said that any man who worked hard and honest would be treated fairly. Any man who didn't could go back to camp. Simple as that. Friedrich worked that first day until his back screamed and his hands blistered. He operated a seed drill, walking behind it through the soft earth, making sure the mechanism fed properly. Thomas Donovan watched from a distance for the first few hours, then disappeared. By evening, when the truck came to collect the prisoners, Friedrich had planted 12 acres. Donovan approached him as he climbed into the truck. He said one word in German, which he'd clearly learned phonetically and probably mispronounced badly. Gut. Good. Friedrich nodded, too exhausted to respond. The work continued through spring and into summer. The German prisoners became a familiar presence on farms throughout the area. Some farmers remained hostile, working the prisoners hard and showing no kindness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Others, like Thomas Donovan, maintained professional distance but treated the men fairly. Friedrich found himself assigned to the Donovan ranch regularly. He learned the layout of the property. The main house, a solid two-story structure built from local limestone. The barn, massive and red, smelling of hay and cattle. The machine shed where tractors and implements waited. The chicken coop. The garden where Catherine Donovan grew vegetables. The endless fields of wheat and corn. Sean Donovan, the youngest son, was curious about the German prisoners in a way his father was not. He would approach Friedrich during water breaks, asking questions in careful English that Friedrich struggled to understand. "Where are you from? What's Germany like? Did you fight in the war?" Friedrich's English was minimal, learned from a few months in American custody and absorbed gradually from conversation. But he tried to answer. He told Sean about Bavaria. About mountains and dairy cows. About his brother who died in Russia. Sean listened with an intensity that surprised Friedrich. The boy seemed to be trying to reconcile the propaganda he'd been taught about Germans with the exhausted young man drinking water in front of him. The breakthrough came in late June 1944. Friedrich was repairing a section of fence line when one of the Donovan's cattle, a massive Hereford bull, broke through a gate and charged across the field. The animal was notorious for its aggressive temperament, and everyone on the ranch gave it wide berth. But as the bull thundered across the pasture, Friedrich saw Sean Donovan directly in its path. The boy had been checking irrigation ditches and hadn't heard the commotion. He looked up just as the bull lowered its head and accelerated toward him. Friedrich didn't think. He dropped his tools and ran, shouting in German, waving his arms. The bull, confused by the noise and movement, veered slightly. Those few seconds gave Sean time to scramble toward the fence. The bull turned its attention to Friedrich, who suddenly realized he was in the middle of an open field with an enraged animal bearing down on him. He ran toward the nearest structure, a small equipment shed about 50 yards away. The bull gained on him. Friedrich could hear its hooves pounding the earth, could feel the ground shaking. He reached the shed and dove inside, pulling the door closed just as the bull slammed into it with enough force to crack the wood. Thomas Donovan and two ranch hands arrived minutes later with ropes and managed to secure the bull. When they opened the shed door, they found Friedrich sitting against the back wall, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Thomas stared at him for a long moment. Then he reached out his hand and pulled Friedrich to his feet. That evening, when the truck came to collect the prisoners, Thomas told the driver that Friedrich would be staying for dinner. The driver shrugged and drove off with the other men. Catherine Donovan set an extra place at the table without comment. Sean couldn't stop talking about what had happened, describing Friedrich's run toward the shed in breathless detail. Thomas was quieter, but his attitude had shifted. After dinner, he took Friedrich out to the porch. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Thomas asked Friedrich about his family. Friedrich struggled with the English but managed to convey the basics. His father. His brother who died. The farm in Bavaria. Thomas listened, then told Friedrich about his own sons fighting overseas. About the fear that woke him every night. About the telegram that every parent dreaded. From that evening forward, Friedrich's status at the Donovan ranch changed subtly. He was still a prisoner of war. He still rode the truck back to camp each night. But Thomas began teaching him things beyond basic farm labor. How to repair the temperamental tractor engine. How to read the soil for moisture content. How to manage the cattle rotation between pastures. Catherine would send food back with him, extra bread or cookies wrapped in cloth. Sean would save newspapers and try to teach Friedrich new English words during breaks. The work became more skilled. By autumn 1944, Friedrich was operating heavy machinery, helping with the wheat harvest, assisting with cattle breeding decisions. Thomas trusted him with tasks that required judgment and experience. Other farmers noticed. Some complained that Donovan was treating a German prisoner too well. Thomas ignored them. He was a practical man. Friedrich worked harder than two regular hired hands. He was reliable, skilled, and learning fast. That was all that mattered. The war in Europe intensified through late 1944 and into 1945. News filtered into the camp about German defeats on the eastern and western fronts. Friedrich heard about the Allied advance into Germany. About cities bombed into rubble. About the collapse of the Wehrmacht. He wrote letters to his father through the Red Cross system but received no replies. He didn't know if his father was alive or if the farm still existed. The uncertainty gnawed at him. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The news spread through Camp Atlanta like wildfire. Some prisoners were jubilant, grateful the war was over. Others were despondent, mourning the defeat of their homeland. Friedrich felt only numbness. The war that had consumed his youth was finished, but what waited for him? Return to a devastated Germany? To a farm that might not exist? To a father who might be dead? Thomas Donovan found Friedrich sitting alone behind the barn 3 days after the surrender, staring at nothing. Thomas sat down beside him without speaking. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Thomas said something that would change Friedrich's life. He said that when repatriation began, many prisoners would return to Germany. But he said that America needed good farmers. That Nebraska had land and opportunity. That a man who worked hard could build a life here. He said it carefully, not quite an offer, not quite a suggestion. Just a statement of possibility. Friedrich looked at Thomas and asked the question that terrified him. Why would you help me? Thomas considered the question for a long moment. Then he said that he'd spent 2 years angry at Germans, angry at the war that took his sons away. But anger was exhausting. And Friedrich wasn't the abstraction called Germany. He was just a young man who worked hard and had saved Sean's life. Thomas said he'd been thinking about Patrick and Michael overseas. He hoped that if they were prisoners somewhere, someone would show them basic human decency. Maybe this was how you balanced the scales. The path from enemy POW to American citizen was neither quick nor simple. The first challenge was administrative. After the war ended, the United States government moved to repatriate German prisoners as quickly as possible. Most POWs were shipped back to Germany between late 1945 and mid-1946. But there were exceptions for prisoners who had special skills or who were sponsored by American citizens. Thomas Donovan began working through the bureaucratic maze in June 1945. He contacted his congressman, a man named Harold Peterson who represented Nebraska's 3rd District. He wrote letters explaining the situation. A German POW who had worked on his ranch. Who had specialized agricultural skills. Who wanted to remain in America legally. Peterson was sympathetic but warned that anti-German sentiment made such cases difficult. Immigration quotas were strict. Public opinion was hostile. Every application would face scrutiny. Thomas persisted. He gathered testimonials from other farmers who had worked with Friedrich. He documented Friedrich's work record. He contacted the camp commander at Camp Atlanta, Major Robert Ellis, who provided an official statement confirming Friedrich's exemplary conduct. He even enlisted Catherine and Sean to write letters describing the incident with the bull. The application package grew thicker. Meanwhile, Friedrich remained at Camp Atlanta through the summer and fall of 1945. The population dwindled as prisoners were shipped out in groups. Friends he'd made disappeared, loaded onto trucks bound for processing centers and transport ships. Each departure heightened Friedrich's anxiety. He heard nothing about his application. No updates. No acknowledgement. He worked at the Donovan Ranch and waited. In November 1945, Friedrich received his first letter from Germany. His father was alive. The farm had survived, though barely. Karl Hartmann wrote that Bavaria was in chaos. Food was scarce. The occupying American forces were struggling to maintain order. He asked when Friedrich would return home. The letter tore at Friedrich. His father needed him. But the thought of returning to that devastated landscape, to a farm that could barely sustain one person let alone two, filled him with despair. He had glimpsed another possibility here in Nebraska. Open land. Opportunity. A future that extended beyond mere survival. He wrote back to his father. He explained about the Donovan Ranch. About the application to remain in America. About the possibility of building something new. The letter took weeks to arrive and weeks more for a response. When Karl Hartmann's reply came, it was brief. He wrote that he was old and tired. That he understood Friedrich's decision. That every father wants his son to have a better life than he had. He gave Friedrich his blessing and told him not to look back. The approval came in January 1946. Congressman Peterson's office sent a telegram to the Donovan Ranch. Friedrich's application to remain in the United States had been approved on a provisional basis. He would be released from POW status but would need to maintain employment sponsorship. After 5 years of continuous legal residence and good conduct, he could apply for citizenship. The telegram was bureaucratic and cold, but to Friedrich it represented a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance. His release from Camp Atlanta was anticlimactic. He signed papers, received documentation, and walked out of the camp in February 1946 wearing civilian clothes that Thomas had provided. He moved into a small room above the machine shed at the Donovan Ranch. His official status was hired hand, but the reality was more complex. Thomas began teaching him the business side of ranching. Profit margins. Market prices. Breeding records. Equipment maintenance schedules. Friedrich absorbed everything like a man dying of thirst. The first year of freedom was harder than Friedrich anticipated. The legal freedom didn't erase the social barriers. In Holdridge and surrounding towns, he was still the German. Store clerks served him with tight lips. People crossed the street to avoid him. At the local feed store, another customer confronted him, demanding to know how he dared show his face in town. The man's son had died at the Battle of the Bulge. Friedrich had no defense, no words that could bridge that chasm of grief. He simply left. Thomas Donovan's sons returned from the war in 1946. Patrick came home in March, thinner and harder than when he'd left, with malaria scars and nightmares. Michael returned in June, walking with a slight limp from shrapnel wounds sustained in France. Their reactions to Friedrich were complex. Patrick initially refused to acknowledge him, treating Friedrich as if he didn't exist. Michael was more pragmatic, recognizing Friedrich's value to the ranch but maintaining strict emotional distance. The tension simmered through spring and summer. Friedrich worked harder, trying to prove his worth through sheer effort. He was first to rise and last to bed. He took on the dirtiest, most difficult jobs without complaint. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Patrick's hostility softened. The moment of change came during a crisis in August 1946. A summer storm rolled across the prairie with violent intensity. Lightning struck one of the main barns, igniting the hay stored inside. The fire spread quickly, threatening to consume the entire structure and the cattle sheltered within. Everyone on the ranch rushed to fight the fire. Friedrich ran into the burning barn alongside Patrick, both men working to drive cattle out through the smoke and flames. A beam collapsed, pinning Patrick's leg. Friedrich, without hesitation, lifted the burning timber enough for Patrick to pull free, badly burning his own hands in the process. They stumbled out of the barn together, coughing and singed. The barn was a total loss, but the cattle were saved. Patrick looked at Friedrich's blistered hands and asked why he'd risked himself. Friedrich, his English much improved after months of immersion, said simply that Patrick was needed here. His family needed him. Patrick stared at him for a long moment, then extended his good hand. They shook, an acknowledgement that transcended words. The years that followed were ones of gradual integration and growth. Friedrich's English improved until he spoke with only a slight accent. He learned American customs, American holidays, American ways of doing business. Thomas Donovan increased his responsibilities until Friedrich was effectively the ranch foreman, managing day-to-day operations and supervising seasonal workers. The local community, seeing Friedrich's commitment and Thomas's trust, slowly accepted his presence. In 1948, Friedrich met Anna Kowalski at a church social in Holdridge. Anna was the daughter of Polish immigrants who had settled in Nebraska in the 1920s. She worked as a teacher at the local elementary school. She was pretty and practical, with brown hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. They talked for hours that first evening, discovering shared experiences of being outsiders, of building new lives far from their origins. Friedrich was captivated. Their courtship was careful and proper. Friedrich would drive to town on Sundays to attend church and then spend the afternoon with Anna and her family. Her father, Joseph, was initially suspicious of the young German rancher, but Anna's mother Maria saw something in Friedrich that reminded her of her own father, men who had crossed oceans to build new lives. The approval came gradually, measured in shared meals and conversations that stretched late into evenings. Friedrich and Anna married in June 1949. Thomas Donovan gave them a wedding gift that stunned Friedrich to silence. A section of land on the northern edge of the ranch, 640 acres with water rights and grazing access. The land came with conditions. Friedrich would operate it as his own ranch but would coordinate with the larger Donovan operation. He would maintain the legacy that Thomas had spent his life building. Most importantly, he would pass it on to the next generation. Friedrich stood in the middle of his own land on his wedding day, Anna beside him in her simple white dress, and felt the weight of impossible fortune. 7 years ago he had been an enemy soldier surrendering in the North African desert. Now he stood on his own land in Nebraska, married to a woman he loved, with a future that seemed limitless. The statistics that had worked against him, the hatred and suspicion that should have crushed any possibility, had collapsed before determination and the unlikely kindness of strangers who became family. The work of building a ranch from scratch consumed the next several years. Friedrich and Anna lived in a small house that Friedrich built with help from Patrick and Michael Donovan. It was nothing fancy, 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Friedrich bought cattle with money he'd saved and small loans from Thomas. He planted winter wheat. He repaired fences and dug irrigation ditches. Anna taught school during the week and worked alongside Friedrich on weekends. Their first child, a daughter they named Catherine after Thomas's wife, was born in 1950. A son, Carl, followed in 1952. The Korean War brought new challenges. Anti-German sentiment, which had faded somewhat, flared again as America found itself in another conflict. But Friedrich had built relationships and credibility over years. When whispers circulated about the German rancher north of town, Thomas Donovan would appear at the feed store or the bank and quietly remind people that Friedrich had worked his land for nearly a decade, had saved his son's life, and was as good a neighbor as any in the county. In 1951, Friedrich applied for American citizenship. The process required character references, proof of continuous legal residence, and a civics examination. Thomas Donovan, Patrick Donovan, and 5 other local farmers provided testimonials. Friedrich studied American history and government with an intensity that amused Anna. He could recite the Bill of Rights and explain the Electoral College better than most native-born Americans. The citizenship ceremony took place in the federal courthouse in Omaha on a cold February day in 1952. Friedrich stood with 30 other immigrants from a dozen countries, raised his right hand, and swore allegiance to the United States of America. When the judge presented him with his citizenship certificate, Friedrich's hands shook. He thought of his father in Bavaria, of George who died in Russia, of the impossible chain of circumstances that had brought him to this moment. Anna stood in the gallery with baby Carl, tears streaming down her face. Friedrich Hartmann became an American citizen, but he never forgot where he came from or the people who made his transformation possible. He learned that Thomas Donovan had never told anyone about the months of letter writing and political pressure required to secure Friedrich's release from POW status. That Catherine had baked dozens of pies to soften the attitudes of suspicious neighbors. That Patrick had quietly defended Friedrich against accusations and rumors in town. The debt was unpayable, but Friedrich tried to honor it through how he lived. The Hartmann ranch grew slowly but steadily through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Friedrich proved to be an exceptional rancher, combining the agricultural knowledge from his Bavarian childhood with techniques learned from Thomas Donovan and his own innovations. He pioneered rotational grazing methods in the area, improving both cattle health and grassland sustainability. He invested in better breeding stock. He diversified into both cattle and wheat, balancing risk across markets. His reputation spread beyond Holdridge. Other ranchers would visit to see his operation, to learn his methods. Friedrich was generous with knowledge, never proprietary. He remembered being the outsider who needed help. Now, established and successful, he extended that help to others. When a young veteran returned from Vietnam in 1968 and tried to start a small ranch, Friedrich mentored him, lending equipment and providing advice. When a neighboring family faced bankruptcy after a failed harvest, Friedrich bought their cattle at above market prices to give them capital to survive. The children grew. Catherine was serious and studious, eventually attending the University of Nebraska to study agriculture. Carl was more adventurous, talking about seeing the world before settling down. Two more children followed, Thomas in 1954 and Maria in 1956, both named to honor the people who had shaped their father's life. The small two-room house was expanded repeatedly until it became a substantial ranch home. Thomas Donovan died in 1967 at the age of 71. His funeral was one of the largest Holdridge had ever seen, with ranchers and farmers from across 3 counties in attendance. Friedrich served as a pallbearer alongside Thomas's sons. At the reception, Patrick Donovan told a story that few had heard. He described finding his father crying at the kitchen table one night in 1945, holding letters from the War Department about Michael's wounds. Patrick had asked what was wrong, and Thomas had said that hate was destroying him, that anger at Germans was eating him alive. He said he needed to remember that Germans were people, not abstractions. That's why he decided to really see the young German prisoner working his fields. To treat Friedrich as a human being rather than an enemy. Patrick said his father believed that decision saved his soul as much as it saved Friedrich's future. The story reframed everything Friedrich thought he understood about his own history. He had believed himself the beneficiary of Thomas Donovan's generosity. He hadn't realized that the relationship had been reciprocal, that in some way his presence had helped Thomas Donovan heal from the wounds of war and fear. The realization was both humbling and profound. Catherine Donovan followed her husband a year later, dying peacefully in her sleep. Friedrich and Anna sat with Patrick, Michael, and Sean at the funeral, the bonds between families now spanning decades and generations. Sean Donovan, who Friedrich had saved from the bulls so many years ago, had become a successful veterinarian serving ranchers across the region. He told Friedrich that his decision to become a vet came directly from watching Friedrich work with animals, seeing the patience and care that good animal husbandry required. The 1970s brought changes to American agriculture. Small family ranches faced pressure from corporate operations. Equipment became more expensive and sophisticated. Market volatility increased. Some neighbors sold out, unable to compete. Friedrich adapted, investing carefully, diversifying income streams, maintaining the conservative financial principles that Thomas Donovan had taught him. The Hartmann ranch not only survived but continued to grow modestly. Catherine Hartmann graduated from university and returned to help manage the ranch. She brought new ideas about sustainable agriculture and modern business practices. Father and daughter worked together to modernize operations while maintaining the core values that had built the ranch. Carl, after several years traveling and working various jobs, also returned home in 1975, admitting that the ranch had always been where he was meant to be. The family operation expanded to include land leases and contract grazing arrangements with neighboring properties. Friedrich's story became somewhat legendary in the area. Newspaper reporters would occasionally visit to write human interest stories about the German POW who became a successful Nebraska rancher. Friedrich was always gracious but uncomfortable with the attention. He would deflect, insisting that the real story was about Thomas Donovan's kindness and the community that gave him a chance. He emphasized that he was not special, that thousands of immigrants had built lives in America, that his journey was remarkable only in its specific circumstances, not in its fundamental arc. In 1982, Friedrich received a letter from Germany. His father had died 2 years earlier, and a distant cousin was finally clearing the family estate. Enclosed were photographs from Friedrich's childhood. Pictures of the farm in Oberammergau. His mother, whom he barely remembered. George in his Wehrmacht uniform. The images pulled Friedrich back across 40 years and thousands of miles. He spent the evening telling his children about Bavaria, about growing up in the shadow of mountains, about the dairy farm that had sustained his family for generations. Anna found him later that night standing outside, looking at the Nebraska sky. She asked what he was thinking. Friedrich said he was trying to reconcile the two lives he'd lived. The German farm boy and the American rancher. They seemed like different people, separated by an unbridgeable gulf. But they were both him. Anna took his hand and said that perhaps that was the point. People contain multitudes. History and identity were not fixed but fluid. Friedrich was Bavarian and Nebraskan, German and American, shaped by war and peace, by loss and finding. The 1980s brought new challenges and opportunities. Catherine married a local teacher, producing the first grandchildren. Carl married as well, choosing a woman from Omaha who adapted remarkably well to ranch life. Thomas became a vocational agriculture teacher at the local high school, spreading the knowledge that Friedrich had accumulated. Maria, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, though she specialized in agricultural law and returned to serve rural clients. Friedrich and Anna celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1989. The party was held at the ranch, with hundreds of people in attendance. Ranchers and farmers, townspeople from Holdridge, old friends and new. Patrick and Michael Donovan were there, both men now in their 60s. Sean Donovan gave a toast, describing the day Friedrich saved him from the bull, saying that his entire life, his career, his family, all existed because a young German prisoner chose courage over self-preservation. Friedrich responded briefly. He thanked Anna for 40 years of patience and partnership. He thanked his children and grandchildren. He thanked the community that had accepted him. And he thanked the memory of Thomas and Catherine Donovan, saying that every acre he farmed, every decision he made, was informed by their example. He said that he had lived an impossible life made possible by improbable kindness, and that his greatest hope was to pass that kindness forward to the next generation. The Cold War ended in 1991, and with it, the final shadows of Friedrich's German origins seemed to dissipate. The reunification of Germany prompted Friedrich to visit his homeland for the first time since 1942. Anna accompanied him on a trip that was both pilgrimage and exorcism. They visited Oberammergau, found the farm where Friedrich had grown up. It was still operating, owned by distant cousins who barely remembered the Hartmann name. The village had changed dramatically, now a tourist destination famous for its passion play. Friedrich stood in fields he'd worked as a boy and felt no connection to the place. It was beautiful but foreign. His life, his identity, his soul had been forged in Nebraska soil. This Bavarian valley, these alpine mountains, they belonged to his past but not to his present or future. The revelation was simultaneously melancholy and liberating. They visited the cemetery where his parents and George were buried. Friedrich placed flowers on each grave and spoke to them in German, a language he now rarely used. He told them about his life, about the ranch, about the family he'd built. He said he hoped they would be proud of the choices he'd made, the man he'd become. Anna stood beside him, not understanding the words but understanding everything that mattered. Friedrich and Anna returned to Nebraska after 2 weeks in Europe. As the plane descended toward Omaha, Friedrich looked out at the familiar landscape of the Great Plains and felt profoundly grateful to be coming home. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was returning home to a place he'd first seen as a prisoner, to a land that should have been forever foreign. But home wasn't about where you were born. It was about where you chose to be, where you built a life, where the people you loved were waiting. The final chapter of Friedrich Hartmann's life was one of contentment and reflection. He gradually transferred ranch operations to Catherine and Carl, though he remained involved and engaged. He spent mornings working cattle, afternoons with grandchildren, evenings with Anna on the porch, watching the sun set over land that had given him everything. He became a familiar presence in Holdridge, an elder statesman of the ranching community whose opinion was sought and valued. In 1994, the town of Holdridge held a celebration for the 50th anniversary of the POW camp at Camp Atlanta. The event was complex and controversial. Some residents objected to celebrating a prison camp for enemy soldiers. Others saw it as an opportunity to examine a little-known chapter of local history. Friedrich was invited to speak, one of the few former POWs who had remained in the area. He stood before a crowd of 300 people in the Holdridge Community Center and spoke about second chances. He described arriving as a frightened prisoner expecting hatred, finding instead opportunity. He talked about Thomas Donovan seeing a person where others saw only an enemy. The audience listened in profound silence as Friedrich explained that reconciliation was not forgetting history but choosing to build something better than the past demanded. The speech resonated far beyond that evening. Regional newspapers picked up the story. A documentary filmmaker from Lincoln contacted Friedrich about participating in a project on Nebraska during World War II. Friedrich agreed reluctantly, understanding that his story belonged not just to him but to everyone who believed in redemption and transformation. Anna's health declined in 1998. Cancer, aggressive and merciless. Friedrich sat beside her hospital bed for weeks, holding her hand, recounting memories of 49 years together. She died peacefully in October with Friedrich and all 4 children present. Her funeral filled the church in Holdridge to capacity. The eulogy spoke of a teacher who shaped generations, a mother who built a family, a woman who stood beside her husband through every challenge. Friedrich returned to an empty house and felt the weight of solitude. His children urged him to move in with one of them, but he refused. The ranch was where he needed to be. Catherine and Carl managed operations while Friedrich assumed the role of advisor and grandfather. He spent mornings checking cattle, afternoons teaching grandchildren about land stewardship, evenings alone with memories. In 2001, Friedrich was invited to speak at the University of Nebraska about immigration and integration. He shared his journey with students who saw the world through different lenses than his generation. They asked thoughtful questions about identity, belonging, and what it meant to be American. Friedrich told them that being American wasn't about where you came from but about embracing certain ideals. Hard work, fairness, community, opportunity. He said he'd been given a chance by people who had every reason to reject him, and that chance had shaped everything that followed. A graduate student researching German POWs in Nebraska interviewed Friedrich extensively in 2003. The resulting thesis became a book published in 2005, documenting the stories of prisoners who worked on American farms during the war. Friedrich's chapter was titled From Enemy to Neighbor. He received copies and distributed them to family members, wanting them to understand fully the journey that had made their lives possible. His grandchildren, now young adults, asked questions Friedrich had never expected. They wanted to know about the moral complexity of his service in the Wehrmacht. About guilt and responsibility. About reconciling pride in what he'd built with shame about the regime he'd served. Friedrich answered honestly. He said he'd been a young man following orders in a system he didn't fully understand until it was too late. That ignorance wasn't innocence, but it was also not the same as enthusiastic participation. That he'd spent 60 years trying to atone not through guilt but through living a life of integrity and contribution. The conversations were difficult but necessary. Friedrich realized that his generation had often avoided these discussions, preferring silence to painful examination. But his grandchildren deserved better. They deserved to understand history's complexity, to recognize that good people could make terrible choices, that redemption was possible but required acknowledgement and effort. In 2008, Friedrich suffered a minor stroke. He recovered but was forced to confront mortality. He gathered his children and updated his will, ensuring the ranch would pass to Catherine and Carl with provisions for the younger children. More importantly, he gathered stories, recording oral histories that documented not just his life but the broader community that had sustained him. He wanted future generations to know the names of people like Thomas Donovan, to understand what ordinary people could accomplish through simple decency. Patrick Donovan died in 2009. Friedrich attended the funeral and delivered a remembrance that brought many to tears. He described Patrick's initial hostility, the fire that changed everything, the decades of friendship that followed. He said Patrick had taught him that forgiveness was not weakness but the hardest strength, requiring courage to look past hurt toward possibility. The Donovan and Hartmann families remained intertwined, bound by history and mutual respect. Friedrich's 80th birthday in 2004 had been a major celebration, but his 90th in 2014 was something more. The ranch hosted over 500 people. Ranchers from across Nebraska. Former students of his children. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Local politicians. Reporters. The event became less a birthday party than a community affirmation of what Friedrich represented. The immigrant who earned his place. The enemy who became a neighbor. The outsider who became essential to the fabric of local life. During the speeches, Sean Donovan, now 73 years old and still practicing veterinary medicine, told the story of the bull one more time. But he added a quote of Friedrich had never heard. He said that after Friedrich saved him that day in 1944, his father Thomas had come into his room that night and wept. Sean had never seen his father cry before. Thomas had said that watching Friedrich risk his life for Sean had broken something in him, some wall of hate he'd built around his heart. That moment, Thomas said, had reminded him that Germans were fathers and sons too, that hate was easier than humanity, and that choosing humanity took courage. The revelation stunned Friedrich. He had believed himself the passive recipient of Thomas Donovan's generosity. He hadn't realized that his actions, small and instinctive, had reciprocally shaped Thomas. The relationship hadn't been one-directional charity but mutual transformation. Both men had changed each other, creating something neither could have achieved alone. Friedrich's health declined gradually through 2015 and 2016. His mind remained sharp but his body failed. He moved from the ranch house to a care facility in Holdridge, a transition that pained him profoundly. Catherine and Carl visited daily. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren rotated through, ensuring he was never alone for long. He spent hours looking through old photographs, tracing the arc of an improbable life. In early 2017, Friedrich received an unexpected letter from Germany. A researcher from the University of Munich was documenting the fates of soldiers from Oberammergau who served in World War II. The letter asked if Friedrich was the same Friedrich Hartmann who had served in the Afrika Korps, and if so, would he be willing to contribute to an oral history project about soldiers who never returned to Germany. Friedrich dictated a response through Catherine. He described his capture, his time as a POW, his decision to remain in America. He explained that he had built a life in Nebraska, raised a family, become an American citizen. He said he had no regrets about staying but that he thought often of his father and brother, of the family line that ended with him in Bavaria. The researcher wrote back expressing fascination and requesting permission to include Friedrich's story in the project. Friedrich agreed, understanding that his experience represented a tiny thread in the vast tapestry of war's aftermath. On a warm evening in May 2017, Friedrich sat in his room at the care facility, looking out at the Nebraska sky. Catherine was reading to him from a ranch management journal. Carl was reviewing next year's planting plans, seeking advice. The conversation was comfortable and familiar, 3 generations of agricultural knowledge flowing through the room. Friedrich felt himself drifting, not quite asleep but not fully present. He thought about the chain of impossible chances that had constructed his life. The surrender in Tunisia that could have been death. The assignment to Camp Atlanta instead of another camp. The random selection for Thomas Donovan's ranch. The bull that charged at precisely the moment that would forge a bond. The congressman willing to push his case. The community that slowly opened its arms. Anna saying yes to his awkward proposal. Every moment contingent, every decision balanced on a razor's edge between the life he lived and 1,000 others he might have lived. Friedrich Hartmann died peacefully on June 3, 2017, at the age of 92. His funeral was held at the same church where he'd married Anna 68 years earlier. The service drew people from across Nebraska and beyond. Ranchers and farmers. Business owners and teachers. Local politicians and university professors. Former POWs who had returned to Germany decades ago but maintained correspondence with Friedrich sent remembrances read aloud by family members. The eulogies painted a picture of a life defined by resilience, integrity, and grace. Catherine described a father who taught through example rather than lecture, who worked harder than anyone demanded, who never forgot where he came from but never let it limit where he could go. Carl talked about learning ranch management from a man who understood that land was not possession but stewardship, held briefly and passed forward. Thomas spoke about a grandfather who made history tangible, who proved that transformation was possible, that identity was something you built rather than something assigned at birth. The graveside service was simple. Friedrich was buried next to Anna in the Holdridge Cemetery, the Nebraska wind sweeping across the prairie grassland as it had for centuries before him and would for centuries after. The headstone was modest, listing his name, dates, and a single line. Bavarian by birth, American by choice, Nebraskan by grace. The ranch Friedrich built continues operating under fourth-generation management. Catherine's children run the cattle operation while Carl's son manages the crop production. The small house Friedrich built in 1949 still stands, preserved now as a reminder of humble beginnings. The land he received from Thomas Donovan remains in the family, passed down with stories attached to every acre. In Holdridge, a small exhibit at the local historical society documents the POW camp and its aftermath. Friedrich's story features prominently, not as exceptional but as representative of broader themes. Reconciliation after conflict. The immigrant experience. The American capacity for reinvention. The exhibit includes photographs of Friedrich at various ages, documents related to his citizenship application, and a video recording of his 2001 university speech. The statistical improbability of Friedrich's life defies easy calculation. Of 371,000 German POWs in America during World War II, perhaps 5% remained. Of those who remained, fewer still thrived. The cascade of circumstances required for his success, from Thomas Donovan's decision to look past nationality toward character, to the community's gradual acceptance, to the legal maze successfully navigated, to the personal resilience required to build a life from nothing, each element necessary and none guaranteed. But statistics miss the human dimension. Friedrich's story was never about beating odds but about something more fundamental. It was about seeing and being seen as fully human. Thomas Donovan chose to see Friedrich as a person rather than a category. That choice created space for Friedrich to prove himself. His hard work and integrity then earned trust. That trust opened opportunities. Those opportunities yielded success. And that success demonstrated to others that their assumptions about enemies and outsiders could be wrong. The legacy extends beyond Friedrich's direct descendants. The ranchers he mentored. The young people he encouraged. The community members who learned from his example that background mattered less than character. The students who heard his story and reconsidered their understanding of immigration, integration, and identity. The ripples from one life well lived spreading outward in ways impossible to fully trace. Friedrich himself would have been uncomfortable with any suggestion that his life held exceptional meaning. He consistently deflected praise, insisting he'd simply worked hard and been fortunate. He would emphasize Thomas Donovan's generosity rather than his own efforts. He would talk about luck and timing rather than courage and perseverance. This humility was characteristic of his generation, men and women who did extraordinary things and considered them simply duty. But we can recognize what Friedrich could not or would not. He lived a life that testified to fundamental truths about human nature and human society. That enemies could become neighbors. That nationality was less important than character. That second chances, when genuinely offered and seriously pursued, could transform lives and communities. That the barriers dividing us, however high and hardened by history, remained ultimately permeable to determination and decency. The story of the German POW who became a Nebraska rancher stands as counterweight to cynicism. In an age of rigid categories and hardened divisions, Friedrich's life demonstrates that transformation remains possible. That people can transcend their origins without betraying them. That communities can grow large enough to include former outsiders. That identity is fluid rather than fixed, constructed through choices and relationships rather than birth and history alone. Friedrich Hartmann crossed an ocean as a prisoner and died an American rancher. Between those points stretched 92 years of a life that should have been impossible but became inevitable through the accumulation of small choices, daily efforts, and persistent faith in possibility. His grave in the Holdridge Cemetery marks not an ending but a continuation, as the land he worked and the values he embodied pass to new generations who carry forward the legacy of a Bavarian farm boy who found his home on the Nebraska prairie. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.